Let me finish with a couple of critiques from the left and the right of this gift of the Greeks to us that we call Western civilization, both domestic and foreign. If you're a leftist today, if you were a leftist in the past, if you were a leftist in this 2,500-year period, and by leftist I just mean that you think that equality is more important than freedom, for example. It's clumsy. What would be your critique of this? And the first is that when you let people engage freely in economic activity, they're going to make more money. If they're going to get more money, they're going to have more opportunity, and life is very short. And who is to say that someone who digs a ditch or puts roof tiles on the Parthenon, why does he get a drachma a day? And someone else like Nicias, who owns the mines at Laurium, gets 100 drachmas a day. It's not fair. You can't quantify those. And when you try to explain the economics or the luck of birth, you have problems. So very early on in the West, this leftist critique has tried to bridle this system. The Greeks were wonderful at it. The system started with property owners. Everybody had to have an equal size property. When the Greeks formed colonies, we can tell archaeologically and epigraphically they all look like clones. They have a checkerboard. Each man, one hoplite in the phalanx, one voter in the assembly, one 10-acre farmer. And that was the ideal. And then suddenly the Greek philosopher said, wait a minute, one guy might be stupid, or he might not be educated, or he might be lazy, and he'll lose his farm. Or how do we do to keep him on his farm when they're not fair? And then people said, well, we'll make it socially unacceptable to sell. Can't do it, or we'll make fun of you, or we'll pass laws. But they understood from the beginning that was going to be hampered economic activity, because if somebody had 20 or 40 acres who was really good at it, he could produce more food for everybody else who didn't have a farm. And so very early on, there were this war from the left to try to find a system to control it. And it would work pretty well in places like Athens, where there's not one record of a farm that ever got larger than 120 acres in the classical period. And yet we know that same deme in Hellenistic times, and then later, especially under Rome, one deme, the entire deme of Marathon was almost owned by one man, Herodes Atticus. So there had only been 120 acres as the largest farm. We probably had a farm of over 40,000 acres. So we go back and forth. And if you look at, there's never been anything like Athenian democracy. Never anything quite so radical. Think of it. Election to office by sortition, random lot taking. Most of us in this audience would probably like to pick your senators or representatives or president by lot. But that's the Athenians' trust in the common man. Or the idea that when you leave office, you have to go, or to take on office. These crazy ideas of antidosis and euthanasia, you have to exchange property if somebody's corrupt. If you make an allegation and he's wrong and you're right, you take his money. Or you can ostracize someone for no reason other than he's popular. If he's popular, he must be doing something wrong, too powerful. These were things that from the very beginning, and they're with us today, and you can see it in our red-blue state Democratic-Republican tension. We want to free up the economy, and as soon as we free up the economy, somebody says the CEOs are making too much money. So now we're going to clamp down on them. As soon as we clamp down on them, we say, all the money fled to London, and now it's the financial capital of the world now. We've got to open up on them. And we go back and forth. I mean, this is a country, after all, that elected Hoover, then Roosevelt, then after Roosevelt, then went from, Reagan, Clinton. We go back and forth, radically so, because there's no answer to it. What that perfect balance is between liberty and freedom that enriches us all, letting the strong go out and make the money, and then without shearing us, the weak. And we don't know the answer to that. And that was with us at the beginning. The second thing is, we look at foreign policy. How do you call this thing off? This Western dynamism. And the Athenians had the idea that although they attacked democratic Sicily themselves, there's a tendency that consensual governments are less likely to attack one another. Now, some of you are going to say, wait a minute, Athens fought somebody 3 out of every 4 years. It did, so did Venice. America seems like it's getting up there. But the answer is they rarely attack constitutional government. So it was always the dream and the hope of Western civilization that if you could create consensual governments and democracies, you can see this neoconservative idea. It's not new at all. It's old. That then you would have a utopia of like-minded consensual societies, and the dream of the Enlightenment would finally be realized. that sober people could adjudicate their differences through the auspices of constitutional government. That was also a critique from the left, that you have to have some mechanism, you have to promote democracy, you let the people decide, because then they won't unleash this military prowess. On the right, well, you know what Plato said. Remember, bald-headed little tinker? The very idea that somebody could be in a sweaty little shop making a pot or putting a sole in a shoe and he could have the same vote as a man who owned 100 acres and 3 ponies, it didn't make any sense. And yet, that's what democracy does. And the critique that Plato articulates, not wholly accepted by Aristotle, but afterwards it seems to be very common in Western civilization. Other than the Greek playwrights, it's hard to find a philosopher who thinks democracy is that great of an idea. And the right critique is that all people aren't born, as I said, equal. And when you try to do it artificially, you go against something they call natural law. You have to increasingly face contradictions. If you're in Russia, then you have to have members of the Politburo or the Soviet Secretary General. He has to have a bigger dacha than somebody else. You have to hide it. Or he has 7 phones on his desk, and how do you say that he has 7 phones? Or you have an apparatchik that gets more, because that's a human desire and a human characteristic to get what you can. And so the right says that when you artificially suppress it, then it doesn't, you become absurd. And that seems to be quite common as a critique of democracy. And I think in the last 20 years we've tried to argue that we don't want to take the state and make an equality of result, but we want equality of opportunity. The right's argument has always been, you can get an equality of result, but you have to have corpses pile up to do it. The left said you can have equality of result if we improve the nature of mankind. Now, I haven't talked about religion, but the right would also say the government should let people do what they please, let the strong lead the weak, and then there's a role of the Christian religion, the Sermon on the Mount, to remind people that it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than a rich man to go to heaven, that there will be a reckoning in the next world. This is also the critique of the left. We don't want to wait for the next world. But this, again, the point is the right has always had this critique of the West, that it was not free enough, that it was too radically egalitarian and too much state control. There has been another critique. Now, you really saw this break that goes back to the Greeks on 9/11. On 9/12, I picked up and read something, I think it was 9/14, that Susan Sontag, the late Susan Sontag, the liberal essayist, wrote and said it was all our fault, that we all colonize and kill abroad. And then you turn to the right, and Jerry Falwell says, it's all our fault. We deserved it because we're decadent. We had gays and abortionists. And then I just reviewed this book last week by Dinesh D'Souza. Basically, it said the same thing. Britney Spears, Brokeback Mountain, rap music, traditional Muslims got offended. Our natural allies are traditional Muslims. You conservatives have nothing to do with the American left. They're the enemy. They're like bin Laden. We need to transcend our Americanness and have an ideological affinity with conservative. I found it quite frightening. But nevertheless, that's been a right-wing. Dinesh D'Souza didn't concoct that out of ex nihilo. That was been an old criticism that, the combination of capitalism or free markets, personal freedom of expression creates decadence, luxus. That's the theme in Petronius, the Satyricon, Juvenal, Satires, the biography of Suetonius, Tacitus, that the Roman elite had too much. That was Fukuyama's Hegelian thesis, Nietzsche, Oswald Spengler, that the West was decadent. This is exactly what Dinesh D'Souza says, that most people are not mature enough, or wise enough, or educated, or religious enough to handle the benefits that a capitalist free democracy gives to them, and therefore they become decadent. They sit all day on entitlements and watch Oprah, or they get in a big SUV to go down and get an ice cream cone. They're fat, they're lazy, and they're dangerous. This is kind of the right wing. They're men without chest. And that's a very old critique. And it came to us on 9/11. It was almost amazing how Susan Sontag mirror-imaged Jerry Falwell, or how Oliver Stone sounds almost like Dinesh D'Souza. Again, but they're not unique. They go back to this inherent contradiction in the Greeks' bequest of Western civilization. Let me just finish about some thoughts about the future. I said that 2,500 years wasn't such a long time. There's no law written in granite that says the West has to begin in 2,500 years ago. And I don't know what date we use, the founding of the Olympic Games, or if some of you Democratic advocates could say it didn't start till 507, or the city-state, we have inscriptions around 700. Whatever date we use, there was no reason it had to start there. And just as there was no reason it had to start there, there's no reason it has to continue ad infinitum. There's no reason that we have to have a Western civilization. There's other paradigms. The Muslim world is trying to talk about the Sharia, the restoration of a caliphate. We see people in China, Asian values, who suggest that autocracy could be married to capitalism. You get the best of the Western worlds without its decadence. Just seems to me, though, we should realize that why Western civilization has not been extinguished, because it appeals to the innate freedom, or critics call greed, of people to express themselves and to enrich themselves and to pass on their property to their children and to critique the very system in which they live. Nevertheless, there's been periods where it was almost extinguished. And let me just end with 3 examples that I don't understand as a historian. I don't understand how ancient Athens, that had fought the Persians and defeated them, and there may have been 400,000 of them in 480 under Xerxes. A little tiny city-state like Athens that did that. Then it fought Sparta for 27 years. But then, after building the Parthenon, restoring its walls, being more wealthy and more practiced at democracy after 150 years, suddenly in the 340s and 330s, it decides that it can't stop a one-eyed, limp thug like Philip of Macedon. The guy only has 30,000 troops. He's got 1/10 the forces that Xerxes had. And Athens is much more prosperous and numerous. It's recovered. Why can't it do that? Why does it have to give up its freedom to this guy? Well, the answer, I think, is in Demosthenes' orations. I don't understand how the Roman Republic, that only, let's say, between 219, that awful 3-year period where the Roman Republic probably lost 100,000 men killed at places like Trasimene and Trebia and Cannae, 300, 400 a minute at Cannae, where that army probably had the highest level of conscription of any, per capita, of any society we know of except, say, Germany about 1945 or Israel 1973. But nevertheless, I don't see how that small portion of Italy withstood Hannibal losing those kinds of losses while it was in a de facto war with Philip V of Macedon and the whole legacy of Macedonian warfare. And yet it prevailed. And yet, if you fast forward to the 5th century AD, when it's now not just a portion of Italy and not just 4 million people, it seems to me it's somewhere between 60 and 70 million with 1 million square miles of territory, and it can't stop a 2-bit thug like Attila the Hun. Or it can't keep people across the Danube by any classical definition, proportionally represented no greater challenge, much less than Hannibal did, to just 4 or 5 million Italians 600 years earlier. And I don't understand France. I really don't. I don't understand World War I. But I mean, think about it. This was a culture, rightly or wrongly, if you go to the ossuary today in Verdun and see the terrible sacrifices. When the German army came into Belgium and France in 1914, the world had never seen an army like that. If you look at the logistics of the Prussian army, if you look at the way that the officer corps was organized, if you look at the standardization of technology, there had never been, given the constraints of an age, an army like that. And there was no reason the French should have won, or the English. And yet they not only stopped that army, they kept France basically alive until the American manpower came and the British wised up and improved their tactics. They had mass conscription. But still, it's almost inexplicable that a people could suffer so much and be against so many odds and show such valor and spirit. And yet, if you fast forward, not in the case of Athens, 150, in the case of Rome, 600, but just go about 20 years. If you look at the German army that invaded Poland, 1939, we say that they had panzers. This is the Wehrmacht. I went and looked at a tank museum about 2 months ago, and I looked at the Panzer Mark I and Mark II that went into Poland. and I looked at the French Char tank. Believe me, you know what they look like? They look like a Volkswagen with a little armor on it. The gun's about this long. It's the most pathetic tank you can imagine. This is not Panthers or Tigers. And when you look at the numbers of the Wehrmacht that were occupied going into Poland, and you look at the numbers of the French army, which was good, 250,000 people, they could have gone right into Berlin. And even as late as May 1940, with British air support, French numerical parity, almost superiority in many aspects. The French Navy, French armor was as good, French 88. They had just as good technology in many ways. And yet they lost what their ancestors had not lost in 4 years. They lost it in 7 weeks. And the answer to me, it seems to me, about Western civilization, what keeps it going is people have to understand what it is, that it's not perfect, that it is good without being perfect, and it's better than the alternative. And when they do not think their culture is exceptional, and I don't think the 4th century Athenians did, or the Romans of the 5th century, I don't think the French in the 1930s thought that it was exceptional or far better than the alternative, then history says to it, I give you no exemption. And it doesn't, and they disappear. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take any questions.
So we're recording this for webcasting, so I need to give you a microphone. I can figure out how to turn it on. Here we go. There we go. And I was going to say let's try and limit it to the whole question of Western civilization and higher education, but given the lecture, that would be un-Western to limit the restriction in this session anyway, so I guess I'll have to allow any question whatsoever. Here you go.
Thank you, Dr. Hanson. There's a piece that ran several weeks ago that you may well have seen by Charles Murray in the Wall Street Journal entitled Aztecs and Greeks, where, apropos of your talk, you said we have perhaps a little bit to learn from the Aztecs and a great deal from the Greeks. And he talked about Western civilization, and in particular the duty of those at the upper end of the bell curve, which probably everyone in this room, to educate, and the institutions to educate for the good and for the moral, and not just to educate bright people to be bright people. I would be very interested in your comments on that in light of your talk and the nature of this talk this evening.
I think people have to realize that there's this tension that holds Western civilization together, and I didn't give it enough attention in this talk, is a lot of it's moral. Now, you can be a secular humanist and think that your gods are Rousseau, or you can be a Christian, or you can be any religion, but there has to be some sense, and it has been inculcated in the West, that those who have more advantages, and there's a lot of reasons. I don't agree with Charles Murray's racial explanation sometimes, not at all, but nevertheless, whether it's birth or education or hard work or culture, whatever the particular catalyst is that lets some people excel in others, and there has to be some way to remind everybody the system won't work if 2 things happen. 1, you abrogate your responsibility to help those less fortunate by lending your brother who's bankrupt some money, or helping a child that's gone bad, even your own child if it has to be, doing something that allows you to bring somebody some notion of parity. And 2, if you don't do that, and the state has to do it entirely, then the system won't work. And how you remind people who have enormous talents that they have to offer their services to others without patronizing them, but in a real sense of Western egalitarianism, is very hard. I'm very worried about people today with this psychological manifestation that I see, that a lot of people have a cosmic worldview, that they are very, very generous, or they're very critical of their own culture, or they're very ashamed of their own wealth. But yet, the world right in front of them, there's ways to help it that people don't do it. I was talking to a professor not long ago. I was mentioning this before. 5 or 6 offers for $150,000, $180,000 endowed professorship. Market capitalism, great. And damning the United States that created the system that's going to enrich him with lifetime employment and summers off. With the culture of a CEO. But I said to me, why not just teach some kids, or why not just be a mentor to somebody, or why not just be on a thesis committee for somebody? I'm not saying that he wasn't, but that has to be, it's not a political phenomenon of either left or right, but if people don't do that, the system doesn't work. And if the state has to step in and do it, then we know what happens. There has to be a balance, I guess. Yes? Oh.
But,
if the state has to step in and help people, you know what happens? Could you elaborate?
Yes. Well, the state always, in Greece, the state helped orphans. But when the state has the entire responsibility and individuals don't own up to their own moral authority, then all you're asking for is a continual increase in the state's control over the individual, and then you're going to be, it's very hard in democracy for people not to vote themselves, greater entitlement. The money has to come from somewhere, and then you get social tension and factionalism, and that's the story of Greek history. It really is. Trying to find a balance between harnessing the talent of elites or the luck of elites. The Athenians did it pretty well. I mean, liturgies, they said, you guys have to build triremes and put on plays, and you know what? We'll let you be a trierarch and have a big robe, and you can go out in your own ship, and everybody claps for you. Some way of, and we try to do it too. Wealthy people give to universities in a wonderful way and give scholarships to people to attend. I was talking to a European, he was trashing the United States about that we don't support higher education, but I saw a statistic that 60% of those students at private schools, 60% of them are having their tuition, room, and board paid by some type of fellowship or scholarship. It's, that's what is the success of the West. Yes?
It's so confusing. I'm totally lost. But at least if you read the current history, is rich businessmen got control of the government and gave themselves a huge present in the form of a tax.
A tax?
A tax cut. But just clarify one thing for me.
I'll get to you. No, wait. Excuse me. No, go ahead. No, I promise you'll be next. I'll promise you'll be next. But you interrupted him. He was right in the middle of a question. Yeah, he did. He has a microphone. I'll answer it next. Just hold on.
Follow sort of Greek rules here. And actually, I had a hand in the back, but you'll be right after him, if that's all right.
Go ahead.
I have a question on our concept of private property.
Yeah.
If I own my land,
yes,
but I have to pay taxes on the land.
Yes.
And if I don't, the government will take it. And also, when I die, I cannot choose, if I'm very wealthy, choose to whom I want to leave my property to. The government claims that they have a right to my property or my wealth, and they take it.
Now, why would they take it? Because what, you didn't pay taxes?
Inheritance tax.
Yes.
A death, if you want to call it a death tax, if you will.
Yeah.
Is the notion of our private property, is it fading?
Well,
the question of government control over our private property.
We don't live in a natural state. There has to be a government, and that's my point that I was trying to emphasize, that thin line between government responsibility and individual freedom, and they're not mutually inclusive. I mean, they're exclusive somehow. So the government has tried to suggest, and that you gave a good example of something called inheritance tax. It reminds me of a lot of the methodology of the ancient Athenian state to say that somebody got lucky, somebody was brilliant, somebody did something illegal, whatever term you use, and got a lot of money in that generation. So now we're going to try to re-level the playing field a little bit for the next generation. And then we do that, and then the people come along and say, well, if you're going to do that, I'm not going to make any money because I'm going to lose it all for my kids. So then we abolish the property we did in California, and we're trying to do it in the state, and then we're going to do that. We're going to see the 19th century greater estates, greater wealth, and then we're going to go back and do it again. It's this constant yin and yang as we try to find the perfect solution for a problem that's in us as humans, that we're acquisitive, that we're not equal, and yet we try to find a solution for it within the parameters of Western culture. So we go back and forth, and the main thing to remember is as long as you're within these parameters, where you don't let people just create wealth and not be accountable to the state, and you don't have the state taking everything, within these parameters, reasonable people disagree all the time. You had a question.
Well, let me take this question first, and then he'll be next. If that's all
I
right.
promised him the next one.
Well, I've got the mic.
Okay. That's a
promised him
Western idea of
I promised him the
copyright.
very next question. And also, one more thing. This is actually quite important. If you parked in the San Jacinto garage and you need the parking cards, I've got those. So see me after the discussion. So if you get the question, please.
Yes. How does a civilization expect to survive that basically regards children as irrelevant, which is really the case in Western civilization?
I have a bad ear. And how does a society survive when they don't?
When people basically consider having children to be irrelevant nowadays.
Yeah.
I mean,
well,
Western civilization is really in the midst of
if I was going to be reductionist, I would say that Western civilization took off in the 7th century in Greece when the population probably grew at 3% per annum, and it really started to fall in the 2nd century when we probably had a negative population growth, at least among Italian citizens of the empire. And as I understand now in Greece, it's got the lowest population replacement rate of about 1.2, and we were projected in Europe to lose about 40 to 50 million people in the next 60 years. And you can already see it in parts of Germany, East Germany, and you can also see it in Greece, rural Greece, where Europe is really going to suffer this depopulation. It's going to have enormous economic and cultural ramifications. And where does it come from? It comes in the history of the West when life is good. And after all, who would want to change diapers when you can go out and party at 3 in the morning? Or why would you want to have a van that stinks with children spilling their food when you can have a Mercedes? That's the issue, that life is so good and life is so wonderful in the West that you don't want to share it with anybody. And more importantly, you've lost the sense of transcendence. If you're an atheist, you still don't believe that you're pessimistic about the environment or you're pessimistic about yourself. Whatever pessimism it is, you don't feel life's that good to pass it on. Or if you've lost your God, you don't think that there's going to be a life in the next world, no transcendence. You're not going to be judged on anything you do, except you might as well enjoy it. So Greeks have a long discussion of this, and it's in the Roman agricultural writers that people plant pear trees that take 20 years to come into full production, like olive trees, a little less, for their grandchildren. And there's people planting olive trees and pear trees when they're 80. And that seemed to be a very important barometer, as you point out, of a healthy society. Now, you had a question.
Yeah, well, just a clarification, really. When you talked about the Black Hawk helicopter incident,
yes,
I thought you said that the Western civilization that produced the helicopter, those people would be sadder for the loss of the pilot than the people they killed.
No, you misinterpreted me. I said that loss will represent a greater investment in time and education and will be perceived as greater. And so if you lose one Black Hawk helicopter, that will be a much greater argument for a variety of reasons for the West not to do what they're doing than for the people who they're trying to blow up because of the relative perception of the good life. And it's always been true in the West. In both the real term and then abstract have pointed that out.
I'm just curious of your thoughts on the role of the state of Turkey right now.
Turkey.
Or do they want to be part of the West? Do we want them to be a surrogate?
I was in Turkey. I've been to Turkey a lot, and I was there last fall. I think that Turkey is used by neoconservatives to say, well, look, Islam's not incompatible with democracy. Look at Indonesia, look at the Muslims in India, look at Malaysia, look at Turkey. They don't mention Arab Muslim countries yet, but Turkey has a little bit strange history because of Ataturk, a level of coercion and secularism that's not found in the 19th and 20th century anywhere else in the Middle East. What's happening now, I think, is that there's the natural Islamic backlash at modernization, globalization, and in Turkey, rural people, poor people, people who felt they didn't get in on globalization are resenting urban elites who are European-orientated. And that's always been true of Turkey. I mean, as soon as they remember, after May 1453, they slap on the minarets, and suddenly the Grand Vizier, and they have the Italians doing business again. They invite Jews in, and there's a reason why they moved their capital on the window in the west. The cannons that knocked down the walls of Constantinople were built by a German. So there's always been people in Turkey who were Western. So I think what's happening now is we are kind of being a little bit fiendish because we're telling the Europeans, hey, you guys talk about multiculturalism. Nothing would be better for you to show a sign of bridging civilizations by letting Turkey in the EU. And the Europeans are saying, don't take it seriously. That means anybody in Ankara or rural Anatolia can buy property anywhere in Europe and travel without a passport. Those Americans just want us to do the heavy lifting to bring Islam into the West. So I think that we're both using Turkey. And then we have the Cyprus problem. I think I would hedge that Turkey's going to make it and become more Western than not. But, boy, I could show you the things I've been reading out of the Turkish press. If you look at certain anti-Western, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, they're just as virulent as anything that comes out of Cairo.
Victor, to raise an entirely different subject, the whole series here is taking place against the backdrop of curricular reform, or what passes for it. And we had previous lecturers just talking about curriculum reform at Harvard, blah 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 blah, and all this kind of stuff. But what are your thoughts about Western civilization in the curriculum? Is that a free market out there? Should we just say anyone can take what they want?
No,
should there be, since it's good for the soul and all the things you've mentioned, should there be a requirement? Should the curriculum be segmented into certain areas where Western civilization is taught? I mean, you've written on this too. What are your thoughts on that?
I come down as a traditionalist. I mean, there is a reason that the United States, takes more immigrants than all other countries put together. People are voting, and the West in general sees this one-way phenomenon where people are migrating to the West. So while we are the nadir of our confidence in our institutions, people seem not to be able to define what we are, but other people seem to see what we are and want it. So it seems to me that Westerners have to renew this culture by finding out what the West is, understanding that the sins of the West, racism, genocide, are the sins of mankind shared by all other cultures, but only in the West is there this ability to speak freely about it. After all, I mean, I don't think the Chinese, after killing 70 million people, should get a pass because they wear egalitarian little collars and go to Saudi Arabia and say, unlike the Americans, we're not going to press your democracy, just pump oil. And we in the West don't say a word about it. I mean, we have to know what this culture is, and the only way to do that is have some common experience. And what's happened since the 60s, to be very particular, we said we don't want to pick and choose. We're going to have a broad menu. We're going to have this course, this course, this course, this course. And we forgot that we're, and you know better than I, that line from Petronius, sumus hominis non dei. We're just people, we're not men. Gods. There's not 100 hours in the day. Every time you add another course, you take away attention from one. And so it seems to me that we have to bite the bullet and say we're going to have a core course that everybody has to take, and it will be primarily about the West, and it won't be taught as, and I don't really see this age the danger of people teaching it in a triumphalist fashion. I stayed at a very so-called conservative school, California State University, Fresno, and I was involved in the Western Civilization core class. On the day after 9/11, the 12 faculty members all met, and they said, we need to immediately teach everybody why it was our fault. So I don't think there's any danger of triumphalism at this point. So I think there is a danger. I think there is a danger if you take today's undergraduate and you say to him or her, what is the Battle of Shiloh? What was 1453? What's Deus ex machina? They're not going to know. They're not going to have any commonality of experience or any knowledge of what the Ionic Order is or what the Inferno is or what Leviathan is. All of these elements of this richness that we've completely thrown out, and nothing is more embarrassing that sad combination of arrogance and ignorance. So when you see young kids that want to theorize, and they want to talk theory, and they want to talk oppression, but they have no nuts and bolts to back up. It's very sad. So we owe it to them, I think. My son, just one last excursion, he's taking a Civil War class. I mentioned that seriously. He's a senior history major. I said, well, what do you think about Grant being surprised on the first day of Shiloh? He said, Shiloh? What's Shiloh? And I said, you're taking a class in the Civil War, aren't you? He said, yeah. And I said, okay, well, did Lee really lose his right arm, Jackson? Would that made a difference at Gettysburg had he had Stonewall? Stonewall, who? And I said, well, what do you think of the Sheridan campaign? Remember when Sherman said he's going to make Georgia howl? Remember he won the election for Lincoln on September 2nd? He goes, no, we haven't had any of that. I said, well, it's a Civil War. Well, I looked at the curriculum, and there was not one battle in the Civil War. And I don't need to caricature what there were in this syllabus, but it had nothing to do with a major component of the Civil War, which is fighting.
Victor, one back here first, and
okay,
I'll bring it over there.
What we're doing on time, yeah.
How do we explain the fascination with epistemology and philosophy that you see arise in the Greeks that by the time of Plato writing his allegory about the cave is already so sophisticated? How do we explain this civilization going in that direction where they're putting time and energy into these kinds of pursuits?
That's a very good question, and I have thought about that a lot. I think there's, think of the level of sophisticated thought that you just briefly outlined had it been applied to the mechanical or the investment. Why is it in our society that our so-called brilliant people who are investment bankers and corporate lawyers or CEOs or people, why aren't they turning to philosophy, or why aren't they turning to abstract speculation? And it's something about the cultural ethic of that city-state that came out. It was radically egalitarian. It was punitive of ostentatious displays of wealth. And it had certain cultural, social, maybe even religious mechanisms to turn people. And they did pay the price. I mean, Hero made a steam engine. It's a beautiful little model. But it wouldn't take much practicality to say you could put a piston on that thing and they could have been driving Stanley steamers 200 years before Christ. So there's a disconnect that the Greeks have what I think is M.I. Finley called these impediments or blockages to practical, pragmatic uses of capital and intelligence, because there's a social premium put on philosophy and speculation. And the philosopher, like Socrates, for all his complaints and whining, he is a man of respect. And the monastic person who engages in commerce, and from the history of the Roman Senate, is looked on with suspicion. And it's no accident that when that breaks down, the Roman Empire becomes much more sophisticated and wealthy and prosperous once those old ideas of what constitutes success are changed, and they favor more practical money-making. I think it would be good to, I'm not one who thinks that we should pay professors a lot more money, but I think we should try to extend speculation and thinking outside the university and reward it. That's all. I would like to see a CEO try to engage a professor on an abstract intellectual issue. Instead of just arguing over CEO compensation, they could talk in the philosophical realm about whether it's good or bad or what's the message that's sent. But I think what happens is we've compartmentalized, we've made a professional class of academic. And the funny thing about the professional class of academic now, he's aping the value system of the CEO. And he's getting away with it because he says that he's cosmically not, that he's so sensitive to all these issues, and then he's trying to ape that lifestyle. So it's a moral, ethical dilemma. So I think, I don't know how much, yes.
I'm an undergraduate right now, and I can't say that I see the importance of a core curriculum. Maybe you can help me. And it seems like if you just help students...
Could I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Do you know the difference between oligarchy and democracy?
Vaguely.
Yeah, you do? What is it?
Well, oligarchy, as I remember, is it's an elite group who runs society, and democracy is...
And does it have strengths or weaknesses?
Which one?
Oligarchy.
Well, it has strengths and weaknesses.
Well, I think that's good. You pick that up somewhere in your core curriculum.
Well, I think a lot of it can be figured out just from common sense.
I don't think it can.
I mean, it seems like a lot of people can, if you just get the facts out in front of them and say there's an elite group, and you don't have too much freedom because they have all the power. No.
What I'm talking about is the average student that I taught, and I taught working class kids at California State University, many whose first language was not English, and were not getting that reinforcement or didn't have a level of affluence. They didn't find that to be true. And I found that from basic grammar to basic science to basic logic, and I don't want to be offensive, but I did find that the objections to the common curriculum were from people who thought they didn't need it and sometimes didn't need it. But the people who really did need it, they wanted it because they understood something, that the ability to think logically and to speak fluently and to have a large vocabulary other than, duh, whatever, which is what I hear mostly, that ability translates into the good life. Commercially, financially, capitalistically.
Is that what we should be seeking?
What?
Is that what we should be seeking?
Well, you and I don't need to because we've got it. But if you're a first-generation immigrant from Oaxaca, you might want to try to get tired of it by getting it first. And the way you get tired of it and the way you become common and you have a common experience are these courses, because there's really only one way to speak and write and think logically, and that is to take courses where you write essays. And there's only one way to understand what's good and bad about Iraq, and that is to understand the history of the United States at war, the history of the West at war. There's only one way to understand what's good about John Kerry and what's good about George Bush or what's bad about each, is look at the history of the system and the contradictions in it. And what I find is, because we haven't had this common experience, what do we do? We just get these bloviating people on TV and they say, worst mistake in history, biggest blunder. Blunder compared to what? I mean, they don't know the blunders of the past. So we wake up each generation with amnesia. So I think the core curriculum, especially a place like University of Texas, is absolutely essential for first-generation Americans and non-traditional students. That's their way of catching up quickly.
I guess I would agree with you if I found that the core curriculum taught that, but I don't find
what?
I would agree with you if I found that the core curriculum gave me answers to some of those questions, but this is my third year and I haven't found that the core curriculum gives me the answers to those questions.
And what gives you answers to questions?
Well, I've had to go on my own and read books, and that had nothing to do with the core curriculum.
Being an autodidact has got a wonderful tradition in Western civilization. Socrates never went to school. So either did Jesus. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with just dropping out of school and reading. I think that's the best. Homeschooling, it seems to me the kids I had in school that were homeschooled. But when you say you're reading core curriculum, I think we're talking about the same thing. Because when you read something, you read particular text and for particular reasons, and that's what the core curriculum. Not everybody can do that on their own. That's the role of the university.
And in addition, in the future, we'll have the Western Civ program as a model of the core curriculum. So,
Dr. Hanson, there's been a lot of talk about an impending clash of civilizations or a possible upcoming World War III. And if that happens, who will win and how will it play out?
You know, I taught when Samuel Huntington's book came out. I was teaching that and Francis Fukuyama's book, and I said to the class, this is ridiculous. Look at page 120. He says there's 19 wars going on in the world today, and 18 of them are involving Muslims. Where did he dream this thing up? And then 9/11 came about 6 months later. So there was something to that book, and I think what he was trying to articulate, maybe Bernard Lewis does it, is that with about four things have happened. One is the enormous petrol reserves of the Middle East. Half the world's fossil fuels and petroleum form are there. When the price went up, just say from $20 to $60, it meant $500 billion are floating around there. And they're not being recycled. The House of Saud has $800 billion invested overseas. And until the recent price hike, it had 22% unemployment. They're autocratic regimes. Some of them are theocratic. They're intolerant. And people, that's one thing. The second thing is people, for the first time, through DVDs and cell phones and computers, parasitic on the West, that bring them in. They have a knowledge now. They don't need this government. The government can't stop it. They can see that life is materially better. And so they say, well, wait a minute. You buy our oil, you've got the good life, and if you try to reason and say, now, wait a minute, we're paying $60 a barrel. The money's there, and they said, yes, but our rulers have it. And we say, well, have a revolution like we did. Where's your Patrick Henry? Then we get into this argument. So how does that anger translate? The anger is I think it is true that the holy alliance between the autocratic regime says, if you're bin Laden and you're Musharraf, you go up in Waziristan, that's fine. If it's Saudi royal family, you say, you know what, we'll give you $20 billion for Wahhabi madrasas. If you're Iran, then you do this. And it's sort of an unholy alliance, so then that anger is channeled at us. So if you talk to somebody from the Middle East, you say, well, the United States is no better or no worse than Russia or China as far as the Islamic world. We didn't kill 80,000 Muslims in Chechnya, and we don't make it against the law of the United States to have public prayers from a minaret as it is in China. And we did try to save Muslims in Albania and Somalia and Kuwait and Afghanistan. We're no better, we're no worse. Well, it doesn't register because they have been told that we are the symbol of a world that they're denied because of certain things that we do. And it doesn't do you any argument to argue what those things are or not. It's an emotional, deep-seated anger. And that was, I think, unless it is, I know that there's not a person in the room other than myself who thinks constitutional government is the ultimate answer for the Middle East, but unless you have some mechanism to alleviate these angers and to discuss them in a public realm with a transparency, it seems to me that these autocratic regimes are going to play that up, and then we're going to be into a really dangerous situation because we're getting to an interconnected, globalized world where capital can purchase weaponry. And when you have somebody in Iran who says basically that the whole idea of the Holocaust is now turned upside down, A, it doesn't exist, and B, the sanctuary for the victims of the Holocaust was not to preserve one place in the world where a government couldn't send people to Auschwitz, but to ensure, and I'm quoting directly, that it's a one-bomb state. You're asking an Israeli prime minister 60 years after the Holocaust to go down in history as the prime minister who was told, A, this country is going to wipe out his country, and B, they're trying to get the weapons to do it, and C, he didn't do anything. And yet we know if he does something, we'll be into a big mess. So we have bad and worse choices. And I'm a little worried that this idea that, that we're the doppelganger, we're just the mirror image. I saw Newsweek's picture of Ahmadinejad and here's Bush, and they had two sides of the same face. Just like they said Sharon was the same as Arafat, just like they said Reagan was the same. Forget the personalities. One system, a Bush or a Sharon or a Reagan, has to deal with a free press, and it has to deal with a nonviolent opposition. And that's a qualitative, historically different phenomenon than somebody who is a product of an autocratic regime and doesn't face that censure. I think we in the West don't make that distinction because, getting back to Carl's question, we're not educated. I don't know if we have any more time or not.
I have time for one more question.
One more.
I think. This will be the last.
Yeah,
okay. Go ahead.
Returning back to the wider topic of higher education here,
Yes.
the new avant-garde trend here in American universities is a strive for diversity, especially here at UT. It's a huge incentive this year. And in the creation of different specialized fields, such as focusing on cultural studies. How do you view this? Do you view it as divisive or essential to higher education?
I see it as a historical phenomenon that came out of the fact that the United States was 90% white in 1960 and 10% African American, and there was historic, real grievances, and there was a way to address those grievances. But the problem with it is, it's an aging process now. In the United States, as I said earlier, 67%. And I'll just give you two examples of what I encountered at a public university where the so-called white population, I say so-called because I have two brothers who are married to Mexican-American people, and I don't know what their kids are called. When they want to hang out with yuppie friends, they say they're white. When they want some type of mystique, they put a little accent mark. I'm not being cynical, they do. And when I point that out to them, they get very angry. But the point I'm making is, we had a chancellor from Toronto come to UC Berkeley, and he said, I'm shocked that the California population, think about being anti-democratic. He said they voted for Prop 209 and says we couldn't use race as consideration. And I'm going to change that. I'm going to find new ways. And he is trying to find new ways. But the problem he didn't understand being a Canadian, A, with not, and B, not having the melting pot when you look at Quebec and Canada theory as we do, he walked into a minefield. Because the first thing people said was, California is 36% white, it's 40% Latino, it's 10% Asian, it's 10% black. You look at the UC Berkeley, the flagship campus, and what's the enrollment? It's about 4% underrepresented African American, about 8% Latino, way underrepresented. White is 33% underrepresented. So everybody said, well, we'll do it. And they said this to him, and he just about dropped dead. Well, you can just do what you did with the Jews in Princeton, Harvard, and Yale in the 30s. Just tell the Asians, you know what? If you're Asian and your SAT score and GPA does not count, we're going to look for things like basketball, football, and we're going to get that number down to their proportional down to 11, and we're going to give those places to mostly Latinos, but also a few whites and more blacks. And do we really want to do that? And the answer is, why aren't those proportionally represented? The biggest overachieving class are Sikhs in California. I had a student who came in and she was, to be frank, jet black. I had another student who was a Latino who was pure white. The Latino got a McNair Fellowship, and she was from an upper middle class. I'm not saying that these are typical, but the Sikh fellow who was a first generation didn't get anything. He wasn't a target minority. And he said to me, don't you think people think I'm black? If you're black, can't you make it? You can't make it, right? I said, you go talk to them. And the explanation he got was right off the podium of a May Day parade about 1970 in the Soviet Union. And it was so Byzantine and complicated, and the person who gave it did not believe it. So we are such a multiracially interconnected situation. I had somebody from a different country who was watching the Super Bowl, and he said to me, not knowing how absurd he sounded, everybody in both teams are black. I said, yes, but it's the man. Well, both coaches are black. I said, yes. He goes, the announcers are black. And he goes, I thought that people didn't have access. Do people get paid well? They get exposed? I said, yeah. So things are changing, and I think that it's going to have to go back to a merit-based system of colorblind society, and then people who do succeed in it have an obligation to try to tutor people, to try to teach them how they can get ahead. I also think that there's one mistake is that we also have to go back that there's a certain dignity in physical labor. And part of the problem is that we have all of our kids and we put them to SAT camp and we put them and say, if you're not a brain surgeon, a lawyer, or a psychiatrist, you're a failure. When there's something to be said for people who are well-rounded. I mean, that was what the Greek lesson was. Socrates almost got killed at 3 battles. And he was a stonemason. And there's a dignity in physical labor that we have to rediscover in this country. And I think that would solve a lot of our problems from race to illegal immigration if Americans can rediscover the dignity of physical labor, and children should at least have an apprenticeship. Rather than going, I think it would be so much better for American youth to go out and lay cement in the summer or pick peaches than to go to another SAT camp or a summer year abroad or something. That's enough of that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Once again, thanks for coming. Parking cards, and appreciate it.
Yes.
Tax Fuller's friend.
Yeah, he told me about it.
Yeah, I just to validate. That's what the card I gave him when he showed up in Baghdad. I was the deputy commander of the big base there.